Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back, Rabbi Spiro. The
Always
dawning
good to be
of a
back.
new, the dawning of a new age.
Yeah, very intense day today.
What
Absolutely.
a wild night that was. Yeah, so you thought it'd be a great idea to do a follow-up on our last podcast to kind of now talk about it on the other end of the election. And I think these are questions that everyone is wondering now. What is that? This new president, the 47th president of the United States, Donald Trump, what is that going to look like now? Not just on the ground in the US, where there's, lots of opposing views on what that's going to look like. But for our purposes, first of all, as Jews in the United States or in North America, and what does that look like now for Israel, that is really in the middle of a regional war with Iran and all of the countries on its border? And what does that look like for the Middle East in general? Now that we have someone like Donald Trump in office, that we have a Republican administration, where do we begin? How do we even begin to sort of contextualize this?
Right. So I remember we left off last week. It was like a cliffhanger. It was right before the election. And without delving into American politics, which you can't touch because it's too toxic, I was talking about the implications of what the two parties were standing for was a very kind of different worldview in general. About where America, which is the leading country of the West, is going. And that also has huge implications. We talked about this very interesting relationship that America's had with Israel that has developed over the years and how it changed dramatically with the end of the Cold War. And it's very much in flux today. There's so many layers to this relationship. We mentioned the notion of that, essentially Israel's the America's aircraft carrier, so to speak, this little it's not a floating island, but it's an island, not figuratively, of liberal Western democracy based on the Judeo-Christian values, which are the foundation of Western civilization, of which America is the ultimate symbol of, projecting its power into the world and being the great stabilizing superpower, and how so many things were in flux. And where like we talked about George Gilder at the end of the last. I mentioned the guy who wrote the book The Israel Test, and he basically was talking about how it goes for Israel is how it's going to go for America. It's kind of like we're locked into this dance with the United States, and the implications of what happened in the election. I went to bed last night we're 7 hours ahead. In the middle of the night, I woke up a couple times, and I never do this, but I literally look at my phone to see what's going on, and it was. So I think I was even dreaming about the election, but we woke up to a very, it was such a tight race, and it turned out not to be so tight. At least it's not over yet, the final results, but
Right.
we're back to, Republicans in power, Donald Trump round two, a very unique event. I think was it Grover Cleveland was the only other president who's ever been elected twice, but not consecutively. And what that means,
I thought maybe
um,
wasn't there something with Nixon also? There was some kind of comeback experience there with Nixon as well politically, but
well, he
um,
lost, but he came back and won. He ran
right.
against Kennedy, and he did come back and win later. But he didn't.
Mhm.
He wasn't in office twice. He had to resign at
Right.
the, his
Right.
term, but he never came back from that one. But in terms of where it fits in, I think the immediate thing to focus on, I think it's interesting, and work our way out is like the immediate implications for what's going on in Israel, like in the moment now, not looking at the bigger context of the Middle East and the Arab-Israeli conflict and the relationship. I was watching on Fox News, and Trey Yangst, who's the reporter who's been embedded here since October 7th, is walking around the street and interviewing Israelis on the street to see what they think. And it's interesting that Donald Trump has been previously, because of his very staunch support for Israel and recognizing Israel's control of the Golan Heights and moving the embassy to Jerusalem, he's very, very popular in Israel. And so the average man on the street is quite happy. And we also know that that the Bibi Netanyahu, we talked about this in the last episode, had a very difficult relationship with Barack Obama. Okay, it's true, Barack Obama did guarantee a significant amount of military aid to Israel, but the personal relationship was very difficult and ended with some very concrete negative impact against Israel from the United States, including failure to veto a Security Council resolution at the end of Obama's tenure against settlements, stuff like that. And then Trump comes along and everything's really good. And then the Biden administration initially jumped in full throttle supporting Israel after October 7th, but since then it's gotten very complicated. So I think from the point of view of Bibi Netanyahu personally, who's the prime minister now, I think he's quite happy. Okay, that I'm sure he knows Trump, and I think he feels there'll be less pressure on Israel, and I
Right.
think the average Israeli is very happy about the results because there's even a very there's a deadline coming up, by the way, because of what we're doing in northern Gaza and Jabalia, that if more aid doesn't come in within the next couple of days, America is going to do like some sort of arms embargo on Israel. And that's a
Mhm.
very difficult situation that they have a lot of Hamas fighters trapped in a small area, which there's no way any UN aid is getting in there. So I think people are very nervous, and the current administration is still in power through the next few months.
Right.
But I think people are looking at the long view that it's going to get better after, the inauguration of, Donald Trump, 47th president of the United States. So
Right.
people
I
are just
think it's really interesting too, because just what, from the little time that I've spent in Israel and understanding, that there is a huge majority of the population that are secular Israelis that are used to be quite left leaning, quite liberal in their views. Or you'd normally see a modern liberal democracy much more in line, say, with a leftist government. But definitely, I think what we've seen is Israelis shift to really feeling good about someone like Donald Trump because on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, security and safety are just at the top of the list right now. And so it doesn't matter so much where they align in terms of other social policies. They're saying which administration is going to help us survive and stay safe and have some kind of sense of security in our own land, which is, I think, just a really different calculation. I think it's fascinating.
right. That's something you don't get when you get in America, how bottom line, being in Israel, despite it's not an illusion that I'm sitting in Jerusalem and it's peaceful and quiet and safer than most major American cities, but you're in a very dangerous neighborhood surrounded by it. And what's running as a
Right.
background program in the individual conscience of every Israeli and the collective conscience of the government, first and foremost, is survival and security, which is an issue that Americans don't have to worry about because there hasn't been a land war in America besides the Civil War. There hasn't been a land war in America since 1812. So they have so Israel, because of the relationship we talked about in the last episode, which is so tight and so much, military aid and this, and that's, the technological edge that America has always guaranteed Israel is so critical to Israel's survival that Israel has always put those smaller considerations of which parties, political policies might be closer to the current government. Israel has become really like a sideshow. And even if it's been a difficult relationship, let's say with the personal relationship between Bibi Netanyahu and Barack Obama, it's not that comes and goes because the president and the prime minister come and go, but preserving the relationship on a deeper level has always been the number one concern that trumps all puns, no puns aside, that trumps all other considerations and the
Right.
importance of preserving that relationship. So it's kind of like a luxury to think about, which political party in America is closer in tune. But we talked about this also in the last episode, the evolution of the relationship between the United States government and Israel, which initially was concretized during the early 60s when America was Democratic run with John F. Kennedy, and through the Cold War, when it was mostly until you get to Nixon, Democratic governments who were the ones who solidified and started selling arms to Israel. And traditionally, there's kind of a traditional Jewish affinity for the Democratic Party and left-wing political ideology, which was
Right.
also in Israel when David Ben-Gurion was prime minister. But we've seen, and we mentioned this last week when we were talking, the switch in internal American political politics, the change in what's happened to the Republican and Democratic parties, and the fact that as the Republican Party has gotten more and more support to become the party of, the Christian right in the United States and the conservatives and the biblical basis of that, and how they've and how the Democratic Party has moved away from its traditional support. Not that there aren't a lot of supporters, and there's a lot more Jewish Democrats in Congress and Senate than there are Republicans. There are almost none. But nonetheless, we saw how the left-wing political ideologies affected the Democratic Party with Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, and you have naturally a good chunk of that party which is now gone against the traditional Democratic support. So we've now had an evolution that has taken place and only been accelerated in the last decade or so, where we see that the Republican Party is now still overwhelmingly solidly behind the Jewish state, where the Democratic Party is now kind of split down the middle.
Right.
I think it may change now with the
Hmm.
elections, and I'm doing a lot of soul searching about who the Democratic Party wants to move towards.
Yeah.
But there's no question if you look at who's coming to Israel, American congressmen and senators, there's still, bipartisan support, but overwhelmingly the lion's share of support, both in terms of individual congressmen and senators and in terms of the party that most unabashedly supports Israel's security without any strings attached to it, has now become the political right in the Republican Party in the United States, for sure.
Right. So, what do you think we're going to see in terms of a realignment? Historically, what have we seen when there's any administrative change in the US in terms of the Middle East? Like, how do people start to respond? There's got to be, look, any change of government in the US sends ripples out into the rest of the world. So, what do we typically see in the Middle East when there's a changing of the guard? And how is this going to impact what's happening right now on the ground?
Right. So that's the big question. Again, from the Israeli perspective, I imagine what's going on in the mind of Bibi Netanyahu and the inner cabinet is, okay, we got to make it through January. Like what? And it's dangerous now, in a dangerous position, because just
Right.
as I said, when Obama at the end of his term, second term, kind of was really pulling back, and I predicted it. He said he's going to do something. He's going to sucker punch Israel with that, with withholding the Security Council veto, something to get like payback for his,
Yeah.
maybe even his personal vendetta against Bibi. Now we're in a situation where we have Joe Biden, who clearly, was removed from running precisely because it's clear he has cognitive issues. He's kind of like disappeared as the president. It's a very precarious period of time.
Right.
But he's still in power and he's still the president of the United States until he's replaced. We
Hmm.
see in the bigger, because Israel, as we mentioned in the last episode, much of what goes on in Israel is a micro version of bigger things going on in the world, bigger struggles,
Right.
bigger power struggles. Middle East is a flashpoint because of its geographic location, oil, struggle for dominance, which countries can get their fingers in there. Um, I think what immediately, like all the countries that are sticking their nose in, be they countries like Russia, which is very much now involved directly with, Iran, because, the alliance that's been created by not by common interests, but by common enemy, which is the West.
Right.
You're going to see, what we've seen in the last 4 years is because of the lack of clarity of the U.S. government in the Middle East, and unlike Trump, who was trying to contain and bankrupt Iran, the Democratic administrations have been dancing with them, giving them money, trying to do deals, nuclear deals, see if they can play around with that, which hasn't really worked. But it's given Iran a lot of wiggle room to do what it's done, both in terms of launching offensive against Israel and pushing its nuclear program and violating the agreements it's made. So I think all the leaders in the Middle East now, and the people outside the Middle East who are players in the Middle East, like Putin, are thinking really carefully that we have a couple more months to do what's going to be, because as soon as the American administration changes and Trump is back in the game, everything is going to change. In terms of what we can get away with, what we can't get away with, all the things that have happened, a lot of the instability, Afghanistan, the war in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, China openly threatening, like they're Taiwan and violating Japanese. They're doing all kinds of stuff. It's all happened in the last 4 years. So the danger now is in my thinking is they might be thinking we have to act now. There's the lame duck president who's really
Right.
not, as we say, he's really not functioning very clearly or strongly. And we have a couple of months to make our moves.
Mm.
So I think we're in
Right.
it's like the storm before the calm, not the calm before the storm. So I'm really interested to see how it's going to play out and what America is going to do vis-a-vis Israel, the remaining months of the current administration.
Mm.
Are they going to stand behind? Because the lack of doing that might lead to like a full court press last attempt to try and really smack Israel around before we're going to be in a much weaker position to do that. So a
So
lot of things
is
are in
there
flux.
a way we can kind of look back at that? Because I think it's so interesting what you're saying. It's a little bit like when you think about being in school and you have a substitute teacher for a couple of weeks, and you've got a sub for a couple of weeks, and then your teacher's going to come back, and then things will go back to like being organized and normal and back to curriculum. You got to do your work and da da da. But a lot of kids, when they know they have a substitute for a couple of weeks, it's like, okay, we can do whatever we want. We can get away with this. We can get away with that. There's a certain so in a little sense, is that analogous to sort of what's going on? Like right now, we kind of have a substitute teacher. We have not only a president who is a lame duck president, meaning there's not much time or ability that he has to enforce kind of new policy or new law. But not only that, we know that he's cognitively impaired, which sort of adds to that. So it's almost like there's like no one in the room. This is the classroom by itself with no teacher, and all bets are off. But knowing that the teacher's going to come back. So have there been situations like this in the past that we're aware of? And what generally happens when there's no grown up in the room?
Yeah, so I mean, the similar situation of a cognitively impaired president hasn't, I'm not aware of that happening, but situations where it's not clear who's running the show and who's projecting, the whole idea of the vacuum that is being created now in a very difficult period of time. People are also not sure because Trump has made certain statements about wanting to end wars. So a lot of people are immediately jumping. Does that mean he's going to pull out completely? And that's an interesting question too. My personal opinion is no, he just wants to come to closure in a lot of conflicts as opposed to letting them drag on. Like let Israel win. Stop like with slow walking weapons to them so they can't win and putting, the reality is it would be more merciful, quicker, and less suffering to get it over with quickly. It might be, versus schlepping it out. Same thing with Ukraine, by the way. We're going to just endlessly give them foreign aid to these two countries. Russia and Ukraine will basically drag each like World War One, just trench warfare and to like destroy each other's economies and kill off their populations and all the young men are dead, that kind of stuff. So that's a little bit of an unknown. And what it's not just the substitute teachers here. So Israel's thinking, what could I do? And the Iranians are thinking, what can I do? And Hezbollah. It's the whole Middle East is looking this way. Whenever we've had a realignment of power, we see this with the end of the Soviet Union. Then we have a vacuum created, and America was basically able to, and it didn't happen. America was already able to, prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, work its way back into the Middle East in a very influential way with countries like Egypt. You could see that everyone is just as people were like the Saudis were hedging their bets, seeing that America was not really fully engaged and not clear on the direction they were going to take in terms of supporting Israel, not clear on whether Israel is going to recover from the blow. Therefore, maybe we better hedge our bets by doing deals with the devil. And that, in the case of the Saudis, it's with the Iranians because they're our enemy because they're Shiite and they want to destroy us and dominate the Middle East. But we'll at least do a deal with them, my enemy, to buy us some time and hedge our bets and see how it plays out. I'm pretty sure now that in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi and in Dubai, they're all kind of thinking the same thing that Israel's thinking. What's going to be with the next few months? Because just as the situation with Israel fighting with Hezbollah and Hamas is kind of now up in the air, what's going to be? Is America going to stand behind that? This could unleash a lot of, last minute. You could see Iran. Let's do something now. Let's do what we can do while we can still do it with a regime that already pulled out of Afghanistan very poorly, has created a vacuum that's allowed us to push our way back in and allow Russia to push its way back in. So we're seeing I think kind of a repeat of what we saw recently in history in the last few years with the withdrawal from Afghanistan and America being wishy-washy on its stance and not really projecting clear power. A little, yes, like you could see they sent in aircraft carriers and a lot of power, but then not really using it, threatening to use it, not giving clear signals in the Middle East is very, very dangerous. So everyone is kind of like thinking about what theoretically would be in a few months, but everyone's looking over their shoulders very cautiously and thinking, how can we get through what could be a very dangerous time? It seems, in my opinion, I'm not an expert, but that Iran may be nuclear already. It seems that they have the bomb. There's a lot of stuff indicating they're doing underground nuclear testing. I don't think it's been conclusively proven, but that's kind of a game changer because when the new regime
Right.
comes into power, the current regime has been very clear in America. I'm talking about the regime, the government in America has been very clear. We don't want you touching the nuclear program. We don't want you touching their oil, especially
Mhm.
prior to the election. Well, now that's over.
Right.
So what's going to be? So it's all very much up in the air. But what I would add is that as soon as we get past the inauguration,
Mhm.
and if assuming Trump comes out with very clear stance, I think
Mhm.
he's going to re-engage in the Middle East, not because he wants U.S. troops there, but because he wants peace there. And he realizes the best way to not have American, because sending troops, boots on the ground, and American military forces into a country is always a last resort.
Right.
If you can negotiate stability
Right.
through doing deals, which is what Trump is the grand master of,
Right.
the art of the deal, by creating stability politically in the Middle East is the best way to ensure that the U.S. does not have to be directly involved in the Middle East and creating peace and prosperity amongst the big players like Saudi Arabia, which is the cherry on the top of the cake
Yeah,
of
so I was
peace.
going to ask you about that. Like, really, where does Saudi Arabia fall into this? Can we get just again like a bit of a primer on the Abraham Accords and what it was that Saudi Arabia was thinking of doing, say, 5 years ago, 4 years ago, or even 1 year ago, right before October 7th? Can we just kind of remember Saudi Arabia's role in this? Because I think they could really be one of the major players that could change the entire tenor of the region. So what happened with Saudi Arabia in the last few years in terms of the Abraham Accords and where are we at now?
Right. So the Saudis were not directly involved in the negotiations. But they were in the process of, I think it was, I mean, Jared Kushner was the really architect of a lot of this. I think it was let's get these other countries, UAE, let's get them first. They're easier to deal with, and they're not quite as significant. And then we'll ultimately bring the Saudis in. And that was in play when Trump was in power. When the Biden administration got into power, he was not the guy who was negotiating those deals. And there's a lot of speculation that one of the reasons why on October 7th of last year, Iran used its proxies to attack Israel was precisely because that may have been back in play again, and this was the best way to stop it. If we can, and going back to what's again the super important thing to understand, bottom line with the Arab mentality, Arab Islamic mentality, and the Islamic mentality is largely a byproduct of the Arab worldview. The power and honor, and power is a very important thing. And who can project themselves as being strong is extremely important. And
Right.
and
It's much more almost like a might is right society, right? Like whoever's the strongest should rule, which is a very different way of saying, where we would say, hopefully, whoever's the most moral or has the right values or has the right vision. Whereas I think a part of the Arab psyche is whoever's the most powerful should rule.
and also the people you have to deal with and be afraid of. Weakness is something you capitalize on. Like if I see you're weak, I'm going to take your stuff. It's just kind of the mentality of the Middle East. Honor and power are the driving forces behind what's going on. And Israel, through its history of the last 75 years, has proven its ability to be very durable, and not only be durable, but make out of a teeny piece of real estate surrounded by this vast. The matchbox in the football field has been able to project an inordinate amount of power and stability in the Middle East, which has gained begrudgingly often the respect of the surrounding Arab neighboring countries, who, the idea of Zev Jabotinsky, the revisionist Zionist leader, he had this idea of the Iron Wall. He said the Arabs only make peace with us when they realize they can't destroy us. And
Mm.
successive wars have proven that's the case. So when Israel is perceived to be strong and powerful, even if ideologically on a deeper level, we know that traditionally Islam is not so tolerant of non-Islamic states being in the Middle East, even if Israel's claim to its real estate is far deeper and older than the Islamic claim to the Middle East. It's just the
Right.
way they look at this was an Arab Islamic piece of real estate for 1,300 years until Israel reestablished itself as a state. But practical considerations aside, if Israel shows itself to be a stable, powerful country that can guarantee project its power and guarantee a certain amount of stability in the Middle East, then it's in their most practical, basic political, economic interests, even if they're not ideologically and religiously aligned with Israel. My enemy's enemy is my friend. If we understand in the Middle East, that the big conflict is not between Israel and the Arabs. It's the, Sunni Shiite conflict and then the sub-conflicts of different Sunni powers, the Egyptians and the Saudis and the Turks, vying for dominance in the Middle East, then just out of practical necessity, a country like Saudi Arabia, which sits on a huge amount of wealth and a big piece of land that it really can't defend, it's actually not a huge population, it's in their best interest to make a relationship with Israel. And we see, by the way, Ellie, it's interesting that once the relationship, which is purely practical and not based on common ideology or religious ideology, but it starts to evolve. You notice in countries like the UAE now, they're banning incitement against Israel. So what you see is
Yeah, I saw that. It's
you
fascinating.
see it's actually they're actually kind of reprogramming the collective consciousness of a state which historically has no animus with Israel, no conflict with Israel. It's the other side of it's
Right.
only other, it's very far away from us. You're actually seeing what begins as a very practical alliance of against the common enemy for various reasons. And also the other thing about Israel is not more than just its political power and its air force, which has shown itself to be so dominant, but the technology and the startup nature of Israel, which a lot of the smarter Arab states are realizing we have to diversify out of just oil, 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 oil.
Yeah.
We need to use all that wealth we can. We can be high-tech hubs. We're in a great location in the world, the Middle East. It's developing into a relationship with with UAE that is becoming much more based on, I would say, a common worldview, which is not liberal democracy because these countries are not, but more than just strategic. It's economic. It's a self cross-pollinating economic opportunities. And that's the best way to make peace in this world is when you have business deals and solid relationships. When you have a lot to lose by not preserving those relationships, then you're far less likely to be at odds with the people you're doing business with, and
Right.
far more likely to slowly begin to cultivate a relationship that is actually really based on more than, there can actually be some feelings there, some warmth and some good relationships. The
Right.
Abraham Accords is based on that. We have a lot in common. We've got to change our paradigm and look at each other as what unites us and not what divides us. And you're starting to see that, which is very, very, very optimistic. And Saudi Arabia is the next country in line to do that. And as soon as they fall into that and start realizing the practical benefits of the relationship, which transcend just a strategic reality and there's so much good stuff that come out of it, you'll
Right.
see them changing their attitude and paying less and less lip service to the Palestinians who are constantly saying no to any agreement
Right.
and more just buying into a mutually beneficial relationship that's much deeper than just the superficial strategic one.
So based on, looking back in order to look forward, what do you think we're in for? Just, look, it's very hard to predict a wild card. Donald Trump tends to not always adhere to the rules of history. He tends to be a chaos sower, for good and for bad. But what do you think are some of the things that you think we're going to see with this upcoming administration change, in the Middle East, that we are either a continuation of what Donald Trump was doing when he was in office last time, or, what do you think is new,
Yeah.
based on what you've seen in the past?
Firstly, with his personal business style, his seemingly erratic sometimes. I personally believe it's part of his business strategy. I think it's precisely nothing is worse than predictability in foreign politics. You have every country has basic interests of protection and survival, whatever, but how you go about doing that is, it's like playing game poker. When you don't know the other guy's hand, you're going to be a lot more careful what you're going to bet. we have to project from the outward in, because what Israel's facing with Hezbollah and Hamas is just a microcosm of that bigger struggle with Iran. But Iran also is not existing in a vacuum. Iran is now has a series of alliances with other countries, primarily with Russia now, and they're doing who knows what they're doing. They're dealing with North Korea for sure. So my prediction is what you're going to see is, just as like when Trump was in power, America was not getting involved in any new wars. It was trying to pull out of wars. Um, I'm fairly certain. I was always fascinated with the fact that a guy like Donald Trump could, on one hand, say some pretty outrageous things about some world leaders, like call Kim Il-jung Little Rocket Man, but then like be doing selfies with him in North Korea. So
Right.
you got to be wondering and he says things about Xi in China, but then he's hanging out with them. So
Yeah.
it's very clear to me, not that these people like Xi and Putin and Kim Il-jung love Donald Trump, but they respect him and they're scared of him because they're never exactly sure what he's going to do. And therefore they can't, you can't let like the fox loose amongst the chickens.
Right.
Like you can when it's very predictable that America is not going to do something, or this is a regime that's not going to want to project its power in, and they're going to threaten but not act. It's precisely, I think what you're going to see is, and that's why I'm so scared about the next few months, is a lot of these people thinking, look, when
Better
he's
do
in
it
power,
now.
we can't get away with this stuff. We're not going to
Right.
be able to do this. Like, because Trump knows how to use America's military might, not necessarily use it in combat, but project it. But more importantly, America's economic clout to, you do business with that guy, you're not doing business with us. And we got the biggest
Right.
economy in the world. And that is very powerful. Money talks. So the most dangerous initial thing for the next few months is going to be a lot of dictators and despots who are all kind of thrown together in this allegiance, in this alliance of common enemy and not common interests, more than just their self-preservation, and they're expanding their own power in their own little spheres
Right.
of maybe we got to act now.
Right.
We got this lame duck president. Israel has done really, really well. It's reestablished its credibility as a serious military force. What it did to Hezbollah is pretty unbelievable, which is restored, regardless of what's going to happen with America. It's restored the credibility in the eyes of people like the Saudis of Israel's power.
Yeah.
They got punched on October 7th, but they came back with a bang, and it looks like they're going to take care of their enemies. But the combination of, but the idea that, these people might think it's now or never might lead to some, I don't know, them doing some last minute attempts to grab stuff, do stuff while
Right.
they can before it's going to be too difficult to do it after the inauguration on whenever January 20th. I don't know what day the inauguration is in America. So we're definitely in a very,
We
very
know last time it was January 6th.
sorry. It was
We know
January
last
6th.
time it
Yeah.
was
Oh,
January
that was
6th.
January 6th. That's what it's I
Because
should know that. Yeah,
we
exactly.
all kind of know that name, know that date, as it will live in an infamy.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Amazing. Okay, so lots of open fields to try to see where this all plays out. I think it's a fascinating time in history. It's hard sometimes to go back so far when we're actually in a moment in history that is happening right now in the present. So we're trying to contextualize it as best we can so that we can make good choices going forward. But I think we'll see, I guess, over the next few months, as you said, what this looks like for the end of this present administration, and then what happens once Donald Trump actually steps into office again. I think it's going to be a fascinating journey. Okay.
Yeah.
Anything we should end with? Anything we should
Yeah,
let
yeah. I
people
mean,
go
like
out
you said,
with?
yeah, well, first of all, you said very true. This stability and clarity is the key role. Instability and power vacuums, the Middle East has shown over and over again. It's not just now, it's in all of human history that empires always expand into places they can expand into. So the more we have a power that represents stability in the world, which is what America has been, not just in the Middle East, but to the world, And again, not necessarily mean going to war, but just showing that we are not afraid to defend what we believe is right is very, very powerful and very important and very good for the world. So in that sense, I think the less wishy-washy, the better. And with people like the Middle East, it's very important to be clear. Very important to be clear and show you're not just bluffing, because the Middle East, the way you do negotiations is a lot of fluff and talk, and bottom people need to know what the bottom line is. So that's great for stability. But I think just one more thing, which in terms of pulling out the implications of what's going on, we've been seeing a struggle. We talked a lot about, and since October 7th, of what's going on in the world with the biggest way to look at this struggle is, with radical Islam and the world, is this very particularistic worldview, which has a very clear expansionist ideology, which, despite a lot of the world not wanting to see it, I really find it like sadly funny when, like some person on the left has an ideology in the West, hardcore, that no, you really don't want it. You're really not this way. When you don't have enough respect for a person's worldview, and what we've seen evolving in human history over the last century plus is, a lot of the Western world has lost its, sense of who they are, in terms of Judeo-Christian ethics, liberal democracy, free market capitalism. This is the backbone of how the world has been rebuilt since World War II. Pride in our national identity. We see this. We see it in Europe a lot, and this is what's been going on in America a lot. Hating on your roots and your past and your origins, and that's extremely dangerous, because it's like burning down the foundations of your own house. Which, if that wasn't bad enough, when you have the vandals wanting to come in and loot it at the same time, that creates a very dangerous scenario for the stability and the security of Western civilization, which is the powerhouse of freedom, democracy, and economic prosperity in the world. And I think what we've seen, which I think, the election in America is kind of indicative of a bigger issue that the world has to confront now, which is, are we going to, the whole MAGA thing of Make America Great is going back to an idea that you don't have to whitewash your past, but you have to respect where you're coming from, what you've accomplished in this world, be proud of who you are and the good stuff. You deal with the bad stuff, but you basically have to have a foundational view of who you are, what you represent in this world, and what's good about it. And that doesn't mean you have to forcibly export it to other people, because that's not what Western liberal democracy is about.
Right.
But that's so critical. And I think what we're seeing, and I think what you saw a lot of what's happened in the American election now, is a lot of people wanting to get back to that. And that's really what's happening in many places in the world, including in Israel, by the way. Even the notion of trying to create, in early years of Zionism, a new kind of Hebrew, which is, like a new kind of person, while kind of cutting ourselves off from our past.
Right.
That stuff really, you have to. Israel Mayer Lau, who was, we mentioned this quote before, who was one of the youngest survivors of Buchenwald, former chief rabbi of Israel.
Mhm.
He had this great quote. He said, "A nation that doesn't value its past has no right to dream about its future." And I think what's going on in
Yeah.
the world is a lot of self-reflection on, like, is it okay to be proud of who we are? Like, Europe is going to have to do the same thing too. America is doing this now. But is it okay to be proud of who we are and realize there's a lot of good stuff coming out of our past and what we represent in the world, that we need to stand behind that and kind of reorient our worldview and be willing to fight for that, and realize that everything we have that is good comes from precisely what we've come from, which is the ultimate discussion of, remember what's next, is when you forget what happened previously, what you've gone through, what you stand for,
Mhm.
what you've learned from, what has worked. And we
Right.
see that, going back to the original idea that, that bottom line is the deepest connection between Israel and America is that Israel is the source and America is the symbol of those values. And it's so important for both Israel as the state to be reconnected to its Jewish values and still be a liberal democracy, but have that as its core. And for America to recognize that it's those Judeo-Christian values that have made America what it is, the great superpower that is not only such a great economic superpower, but the country which everyone seems to want to come to because it seems to have its act together. And
Yeah.
so I think what we're seeing now, and we're going to see a lot of soul searching, and you're going to see in the Democratic Party too, is like maybe the direction we're going wasn't the way we need to go, and we got to get back to where we were in the past and reconnect
Yeah,
to
I,
that.
I think part of the challenge that I see is that it's just become so unfashionable to be grateful for where you came from, or to be somehow, like you said, self-reflective. It's very much more in the fashion kind of trend zeitgeist to hate where you came from, to be ashamed of where you came from, to want to burn it down instead of like grow from it and build it better. And I think that what we've seen is people are having a visceral reaction to this idea that we're going to spend the rest of our lives ashamed of where we've come from, whether it's from your parents, whether it's from your school, whether it's from your country, whether it's from your culture. You can't build a better future on shame. That just doesn't work. That's a more like this idea of original sin. Like you're a terrible person, so there's only so much you can do that's actually going to be good. And I think Jewishly, we would probably look at it more like the way we look at the stories in the Torah, which is here are all the mistakes we've made. How do we learn from those and build better next time? And I just think that that way of looking at things, looking at your past and hating it or feeling ashamed of it, and everything that came before us was bad and wrong and backwards, is just a really unproductive but very fashionable way of relating to things. And I'm really hoping that shifts, because I think you're right. There's such a healing perspective when you can reflect on your past, not just punish yourself for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to what we said at the very beginning of season one, we talking about in the introduction to the Jewish history of George Santayana's famous quote about you don't learn from the past, you're going to repeat it. And King Solomon said it much earlier and much more simply, Ein chadash tachat hashemesh, there's nothing new under the sun. One of the greatest lessons we learn from the past is when a civilization or a nation or a people loses its will. That is the internal rot that will lead to the downfall of that civilization. And the barbarians pour in.
Right.
And bottom line is, you can kind of see where it's going back to with America doing that soul searching and getting back to the good things it has, not whitewashing its past, but reconnecting to what it was all founded on as a nation of refugees looking for a better life based on principles that are the best. You know, like you said, we've talked about the impact of the Bible on government, that the power of the United States as a country is precisely because it's the most God-based, Bible-based country. And you can't do better than the infinite creator of the universe in infusing a society with rules and values than God does, because he's the guy who created the whole works, and his system is the best. So that to the extent, I mean, Roosevelt, in one of his fireside chats, he said this. He says, to the extent that we've adhered to those values, we've achieved our greatest contentment and prosperity. That is the proven point. And to the extent that America now, when it's reached this like inflection point, can really evaluate what went wrong and why the country was so split, and really get back to what are the things that made America great, which are precisely the values that the Jewish people directly or indirectly brought into the world, is to the extent that we get a unified, strong America, which is feeling proud of who they are and relating to the world in a way that is proactive and positive as a beacon of democracy, and not as an empire, but democracy and capitalism
Right.
and innovation, which is what Israel's in the Middle East is a mini version of. And that's the best thing for the world. And that, by the way, to the extent that America does that, is to the extent that the relationship between Israel will be solidified, because the more we see that we have these common interests in mind, and these are the best values for the world. And that's the best thing, not just for the Israel-American relationship, but it's the best thing for the entire human race. This has been proven over and over again. So we just hope that we can see, that America becomes stable. That after this election, we don't have infighting and arguing and accusing and trying to prosecute, Trump more, and then accusing of stealing, all that kind of stuff is very detrimental. but we get that, they do the soul searching, and we get the unity, and that he proves to be a president that is unifying for the United States, and that America dusts off the values and gets back to what it made it great in the beginning. And then and that Israel, we see the same thing happening, that
Right.
we see the grassroots, the unity coming from the bottom up since October 7th. And to the extent that we focus on, what we have in common with each other, both in our country and in the world, is obviously the best thing for the human race. And so let's hope we make it through the next few months.
Yep.
If anything major happening, and then I think we're going to see a lot better stuff happening in the world. I really believe we're going to see some stability, and that's good for everyone.
Awesome. God willing, we make it there. Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks, Rabbi Ken Spiro. Thank you, everyone, for joining us as always. Please let us know if you have feedback, if you want to suggest a topic, if you want to bring Ken to speak in your city, if you want to bring both of us together to do a live podcast recording with your crew. We're really open to continuing these conversations in lots of different ways. Again, there is a live ongoing course right now with Rabbi Ken Spiro on Thursdays at noon Eastern on Zoom, where you get to do a live Q&A with him each week. If you would like to join that, please check out the liner notes. And please go ahead and share, rate, review this podcast. We have so many people who still come up to us who are either fans of the show or who are like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know you guys did a podcast. How did I not know this? So please go ahead and share it out there. We want to make sure that people who would be interested in what we're talking about can find it. I think that's it for today. We might be taking a bit of a break over the next couple of weeks, just in terms of recording, because Rabbi Spiro is going to be in North America. So if you're in a city where he's coming to you, enjoy. And if you're not, then we will keep you posted and hopefully have a new episode soon. Thanks so much, Ken.
Thanks, Ellie.